And some of those challenges, to name a few, include funding, revenue, team, regulation, development time, and prototyping. I do want to call attention that about 3 to 5 of what I just mentioned is really focused on how you deliver, on understanding the product, and how that product delivers a problem or solves a problem for a consumer. And so we'll get into make versus buy, internal versus external, understanding your supply chain, and learning how to execute so that you don't become part of one of that statistic of the 97% that do fail. It's important to have agility to meet a market demand, and it's important to understand what that market demand is. 5 things to keep in mind. Build the right supply network. Understand their strengths, understand your strengths, and furthermore, and equally important, understand their weaknesses as well as yours. Second, product quality. Quality is really important to surprise and delight that customer. Third, skilled labor. Ensure that you have the right people focusing on the right problems in order to execute on a solution. Fourth, they need to know the system know-how, not just the components and subsystems, but the full-on system that you're trying to deliver. And 5, knowing your supply chain works hand in glove with ensuring that they know how to scale with the demands of that consumer as a function of time. So without further delay, I'm Christy Fernandez-Cull, founder and CEO of DaVinci Wearables. Also dabbled in venture, worked for Fortune 5 companies, including Apple and Google. And it's my joy and pleasure to be on this panel with an esteemed group of colleagues, starting with Sarah. She's the founder of Pratik, and she'll dive into more of her introduction shortly. Second is Shreyas. He is a senior engineer at Siemens and also a MassGen mentor. And finally, Andy. He's the managing director of Cadence Consulting. So without further delay, let's dive into the panel. Andy, would you like to talk more about your background?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Andy Wilner. Cadence is involved in firefighting. We are issue resolution specialists. Thank you. We get involved in product development when teams have gone off the rails and the deadline is looming, and we will come in and work hand in glove with the team to get back on track. Similarly with quality issues for products that are already in production. We work with clients large and small, and in industries ranging from automotive to semiconductor to consumer products, aerospace, et cetera. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here, and yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Shreyas?
Hi, everyone. I'm Shreyas. I'm an electrical engineer with about a decade of experience leading electronic product development. I also have about 4 years' experience as a consultant to startups, university labs, and larger companies. My day job is working at Siemens Healthineers, where I'm working on a surgical robotics platform to treat stroke. But outside of that, I also consult, and so I consult for startups in my spare time. I'm also a mentor at Mass Challenge, so I still very much continue consulting to this day.
Thank you. Sarah?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Evciman, and as Chrissy said, I'm the founder of Pratik. So I'm a mechanical engineer by trade. My entire career has been, a lot of people talk about being a serial entrepreneur. I was a serial startup employee. So as I went through different industries, I worked in space, consumer electronics, fusion energy, and robotics. I kind of started to develop a hypothesis of what makes or breaks hardware startups. And as a result of that, I started mentoring at Techstars, became a mentor in residence there, and have been doing that. And with that, wanted to start my own kind of impact company. And now I do consulting through my company, Pratik, and also host the podcast, The Builder Circle, which is for hardware entrepreneurs and to kind of make a larger impact through the hypothesis that I've been able to put together.
Amazing, thank you. So now we're gonna get a little more feedback from you all as an audience to help level set us so that we can provide the most value as we answer these questions. So how many entrepreneurs in the room? Okay, How many intrapreneurs? If you don't know the term, that means you work for a small to mid-sized enterprise and you're building products within your company. Thank you. How many folks in enterprise companies here? Okay. How many folks thinking about creating or in the midst of having a startup right now? Excellent. All right, we'll dive in, and hopefully that helps us as we think about answers to the questions. Okay, first question. What is the reasonable timeline for developing out and launching your product? Who would like to go first? Chime in. Yeah,
Do it?
go for it.
Yeah, well, it depends. And I think you might hear that a lot today. Generally, the timeline's going to be market-driven. You're going to have to launch when the customer needs the product. If it's in the automotive space, there's model years that drive the timing. If it's in the consumer space, there might be the Christmas season driving the timing or the summer season driving the timing. And the timeline can vary quite a lot by industry as well. In consumer, it might be months. In automotive or aero, it might be 2 or 3 years. You can address the timeline with taking additional risk, adding resources, or negotiating the spec of the product. You don't necessarily have to deliver exactly what was asked if you can negotiate the requirements in such a way that you can get a viable product out and add to it later on. The key thing is, the timeline and the risk are intertwined. You have the complexity of the product, the timing, and your resources, and the intersection of those is where the risks lie. Really thoughtfully planning in order to manage the available timeline to best effect is super critical. The last comment I would make is there's a big difference in new product development and new product introduction. So if you understand your technology and you're trying to launch a product, that's much easier to schedule and manage around. If you need to invent something, that's a huge risk. That might come on time or it might not. So to the extent you can manage those bigger inventive steps ahead of time, it's really going to make your timeline a lot more predictable.
Yeah, and to, I guess, jump off of that, innovation is for a lot of startups, you're either innovating a product or you're going into a very different market segment. There's a lot of things that are unknown, and that's why it's really difficult. Everyone would answer that question with it depends, and I think the dependencies really lie in the unknown unknowns. Specifically, if you have a technology that's innovative, first you need to test out the fundamentals. So there's unknown unknowns with potentially the physics of it all. And then you progress into, can I prototype this? Can I build this? Do I have the right team to do this? And then, of course, supply chain comes into the mix quite quickly. And the timelines usually really extend or contract depending on how proactive you are in determining, okay, these are the things I need to buy. I need to have a procurement timeline. Even if it's a component, you never know. Sometimes I've been in projects where we were waiting for one component for 5 weeks, and without that component, the entire system didn't work. So it's really important to know your dependencies. So as Andy mentioned, making sure that you catalog your risks and have a mitigation plan according to that, and have estimations on how long that will take, noting down what decisions you need to make. And those decisions will have test protocols and development timelines that are associated with it. And then when you create your bill of materials, so when you have your components, when you have your subsystems, what the lead times of individuals are, and then that kind of creates your timeline in general and makes it a little less ambiguous. Obviously, because of hardware, things don't work as planned, your test results don't come as planned, and you have to reiterate and you have to redesign. And with that, your timeline creeps up, and that's why. And it's just about the process, going through the process and figuring it out.
Excellent, thank you. How many folks are in the product vision phase versus the new product introduction phase? And was it clear, the difference? Yes. Okay. So if we frame new product introduction in terms of hardware development timelines, we'll bias it towards hardware. It does translate to some extent across verticals. hardware, software, platform as a service. To say there's the engineering validation and test, there's the design validation and test, and then there's the product validation and test. So using that as a framework as we talk about the next questions. By the way, the pre-proto phase, where you're ideating or just creating the widget for the first time or the product for the first time, is called pre-proto. So that's even before all of that, right? So as we think about the timelines and the insights that you just provided, what are some of the pitfalls? So if we frame it in terms of pitfalls for that development cycle, as well as understanding when you should make something versus buy it, because there's a lot of great things out there that you can leverage. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think you've covered a couple of areas on
Yep.
the notion of kind of the early stage tests versus development tests versus validation testing. I guess the main comment I would make is failures are good. You want failures in your testing. One mistake that we see all too often in our business is people testing to pass. And if you test to pass, you haven't learned anything. You want to stress the elements of your design and see where the weaknesses are so that you can take remedial action. If you're passing everything, you might be lucky and everything will be fine, but more than likely, you haven't done enough. So, those early stage tests where you have a partial assembly with, cobbled prototypes and 3D printed parts, and you testing pieces, and especially the highest risk pieces as early as you can, you can't determine that something is going to succeed. You can only use those tests to rule stuff out of moving forward. At the design validation phase, you're going to have your finished design, or what you think is your at least frozen design. And as I said, you want to stress that. You want to go above and beyond the tests that your industry is demanding or your customer is demanding. Use formal risk management tools like DFMEA or DRBFM to suss out risks with your team and go stress that part. How much margin do you have beyond what the customer is asking for? What edge cases could be imagined that maybe the customer didn't specify, but they could happen? So, and then not only fail the parts, examine those failed parts. Don't just fail them and say, well, that was too bad, we got to test some more parts. Go dissect those, find out what happened. As far as the risks, really risks are anything that are going to minimize the probability of you getting to launch on time, on budget, with your desired financial metrics and with your desired quality. And there are countless risks. Sarah talked about supply chain. That's a big one. And we can talk about many more, but the point I wanted to make here was about, I think of risks in two categories. There are intentional risks, and Sarah talked about you're innovating, you're doing something new and different, you're going to take risk. And that's okay, but those risks need to be managed. What might go wrong and what's my backup plan? Don't go forward saying, well, it's going to work because it has to work. Have a backup plan. But even more important than those are the unintentional risks, the risks that are taken because you're new to product development and you didn't think of it. There are formal tools that should be employed. If you get in touch with me afterward, I can send you a list of places where risks are hiding that you can look for. So yeah, take risk, but do it with eyes open and plan.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment?
I guess I'll comment on the pitfall side of things, and you will see a lot that I always think about it in. I think about it in product development, hardware development, but also very much from a super early stage startup perspective. I would say that the pitfalls related to product. In general, I've actually given a seminar on this because I feel like a lot of people talk about what you should do and not a lot of people talk about what you shouldn't do. And I think, well, number one is having focus. A lot of people, most entrepreneurs are very excited. They're either a part of the market that they're trying to get and they are trying to solve a problem that they're very intimately connected to. So what happens is there's a lot of excitement that could birth a lot of different product ideas. And it's really important to pick one, so that pick one or two at max, because usually you have a really small team, you have very limited resources, and you're trying to learn as much as you can. So it's really important to focus. and fall in love with the problem rather than the solution. So you're probably trying to fix something, and oftentimes you have a thought of how to do it, but then you'll go through these tests, you'll go through these validation cycles, and they might consistently prove that that's not the right solution. Believe the data. There's a lot of ego and attachment that sometimes goes into a product. Make sure that you're in love with your problem, but not the solution. When it comes to the supplier side, as Andy mentioned, it's really important to interact with suppliers at the right time of your product development cycle. Too soon and too late both have issues. Basically, if you interact with them too soon, what you risk is kind of stringing them along, stringing suppliers along and not being able to articulate exactly what you're looking for. And then if you go in too late, then your product is probably pretty baked and designed, and now you have to incorporate supplier feedback, and now you have to go through another redesign cycle, which increases your timeline, as we mentioned from before. I mean, I could talk about this for an hour, so I'm going to stop with those two for now, but I'll bring up other ones as we go.
Fabulous. We're going to take a step back as we chatted about verification and validation. Verification, what are those requirements in order to build this widget, right? So that you can hold these contractors or freelancers or OEMs accountable. And then validation, does the customer that I build the product for actually like it, right? That's really important, right? So if we think about just terminology, in y'all's view, what is the difference between freelance, contractor, OEM, SME, lots of acronyms here. And for those that are not familiar with them, here's the granularity. Who would like to go first?
I can go. So I think the way to think about those things, I would map it out like this. I would say like freelancers and consultants are typically people who work with more than one client at a time. And so their attention is going to be divided, but you can accomplish much shorter projects with them. I would say contractors, on the other hand, are people who would work with you only for a certain amount of time. And so you get their dedicated attention for the length of the project. Beyond that, I would say there are other terms like OEMs, for example, or original equipment manufacturers. They are manufacturers that build to their design. And that saves you effort. The nice thing is that since they're building to their design, they own a lot of the R&D work. But the downside is that they're building it to their design, and so you lose some things in terms of sometimes you may not own all the design, or you may not, they may not give ownership of their design to you completely. There are cases where if they're building it to their design, but their design is not a great design, then you're going to suffer for it. There have been many clients I've worked with in the past who have gone through OEMs prematurely in the process, and the OEM designs it to a poor quality, and the devices go in the field, they fail in the field, and then the customer comes back to me and says, "Hey, what's the problem?" So what I recommend with OEM specifically is making sure that you kind of make sure you do the work on the design first, meaning keep your design as in-house as possible, not rely on the OEM to design it fully for you. Talk to independent consultants to vet the design before you go with that. So they don't, you want to make sure that the design that they create for you is something that is not just something you just sign off on and say, go for it. So beyond OEM, there's also a variant called ODM, Original Design Manufacturer. The difference between that is that with the OEM, you own the design in general. There's some exceptions, but in general, OEMs, you own the design. ODMs, they own the design. And as you can probably start to tell, there's some murkiness in some cases over OEMs and ODMs. Sometimes you may own most of the design, you own part of it. There's some murkiness with that, especially when it comes to IP. So make sure you kind of have very clear expectations around ownership when you tap those kinds of organizations. And then lastly, I would say that CMs are contract manufacturers. That one is pretty much what it says on the tin, which is they're a manufacturer that builds to your design. So you fully control the design, they just make it to your spec. It's a much more, it's a process that's driven more from you pushing out information to them. But that is typically someone you tap at a much later stage when your design is mature, you're ready to start scaling up, from pilot production to more mature production. So that's kind of how I think about those four categories of partner.
Excellent. Would anyone else like to comment?
I had actually a slightly different take on the question. Rather than looking at it from the founder's point of view, I was thinking about it from the prospective employee's point of view. And I think you can look at these different models as really a continuum from freedom to bureaucracy, and also from resources to shoestring. So as a freelancer, you've got a lot of freedom, but you also have limited resources. And then working for an OEM, for instance, there's lots of resources, but you also have to do a lot of influencing within the company to get priority and get the resources for your project that you need to move forward. So if anybody in here is a prospective employee, either of a startup or a big company, there's definitely differences in culture that you really need to pay attention to, because it'll really affect your day-to-day experience.
Thank you for that. Anyone else? No? Okay.
I think I would add a last point, actually.
Go for it.
Kind of along what Andy was saying, I think it's also important to note that something I've noticed where startups fail is, the list, essentially freelance, contractor, OEM, CM, kind of fall along a spectrum, and you kind of want to progress through that spectrum before, you don't want to prematurely jump to a CM or an OEM. And so often, if you have a problem, a lot of those problems can be solved by consultants or freelancers first, and you don't have to pay all this money to an OEM or CM to solve that problem for you. So the general recommendation I give to my clients is to start from hiring individuals, contractors, to solve many of your problems, and then kind of have a funnel where as you get deeper and deeper into the process, you get to problems that only a CM or an OEM can solve. Then you have them solve those problems.
Yeah, riffing off of what you just highlighted, if we wanted to level set, at what point in time, right, do you seek a freelancer versus a CM? Can we anchor ourselves to budget as we think about execution, right? So just to add a little bit more granularity, some contract manufacturers, depending on the scale that you want to achieve, are expecting a certain unit volume because they're allocating part of their test line, which, by the way, you have to help inform the test fixtures to build your widgets, whether it's a PCB, printed circuit board, or otherwise. Is there some guidelines from your all's experience to say, hey, if you have this budget and you're looking to set, this new product innovation or development pipeline that's going to work with this contract manufacturer or otherwise, what does that look like through your lenses? And feel free to frame it within a product that you've shipped, and then highlight what scale of a product have you shipped, because different scales require different stakeholders. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but could you lean into the
Yes.
mic a little? No,
Yeah.
all of you.
Oh, okay.
Because some of the guys attending online,
Okay.
they're having some trouble hearing. That's it.
Sure. Who wants to go first?
I can sort of take that on the heels of the last question. So, is that better?
Can
Okay.
people hear now?
Are they?
Yeah.
Better? Okay. What was I going to say?
Sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay.
We're talking about level setting, financing, who to hire, when to hire, why.
So I've experienced working at a startup, and I remember one thing which we did, which ended up working out pretty well for us, is as we were having conversations with investors and other funders, often you can kind of get quotes early in the process. If you give the manufacturer some idea of your design, tell them kind of what volumes you're looking at, they can give you a rough idea of cost. And I would recommend doing that early in the process. So then you can look at what an OEM would cost, what an ODM would cost, what a freelancer would cost. And so once you have all these costs, then you can start comparing them and then scale the solution to the budget that you actually have.
So I've worked on different projects. So I'm going to go back to it depends on your product, I think, because, for example, the first product that I worked on was a CubeSat satellite. It was very specific. And it's not something that you would go to a CM unless you want to build a lot of them. And so what I mean by that is it really depends on what your IP is, what core competency you want to build, and by when. I think one of the pitfalls, just to kind of tie that into here, is also if you have a hardware product that the assembly and the system, it's an integrated system, not making the first one or the first 20, depending on how large it is a pitfall, because you really need to be owner of your product. You need to know all of the problems with it. You need to understand what assembly issues there are. And this goes back to what you were saying, which is like when you are engaging with a CM, you need to know everything about your product so that you can provide guidance to them, so that you have targets on both cost and assembly time, and all of the above. So when you're thinking about going through this process of CubeSat Satellite was one example. Second one was a consumer electronics product that was built at a CM, and first we would make thousands, and then it would be in the million scale. And with that, it was the same process. First, we built a lot in-house. We saw a lot of problems with the housings that we had, with the PCB boards that we had. And so we started iterating with our suppliers to make sure that they were assemblable. We created fixtures so that the assembly process was faster, because time is money, specifically when it comes to CMs. And then afterwards, once you deploy to a CM, training the technicians there and being able to articulate that was really important. But if it's an industrial application thing where it's like you're building one of it and you have partners, then that's usually brought in-house with additional people. That's either freelancers, contractors, or internal technicians. All that to say, with the decisions here, and I think this is what you were also alluding to, is that you need to make an in-source, outsource decision on a component level, on a system level, and an integrated system level, and then have plans for each. And as you kind of move through the product development and deployment.
Yeah, I love that. Love what you said, time is money, as we can all empathize with that. So if you're sitting in the audience and you're thinking, well, I have this product vision, product idea, but I don't necessarily have a CTO or technical wherewithal, and I'm looking for fractional CTO or fractional CXO, et cetera, right? We can kind of turn to, how do you hold, thinking about what questions you should ask, right? How do you hold, whether it's a freelancer, contractor, OEM, you name the acronym, people helping you to execute at scale or onesie of your product, how do you hold folks accountable? I mean, maybe some folks in the room, may not have heard of functional or non-functional requirements or engineering requirement specification. This is sort of acronym soup, that each company does differently. But how have you all held, your collaborators accountable? What sort of documentation should folks be aware about in the audience if they're trying to deliver on a solution?
I can start on that one.
Go for it.
Well, first thing is, you don't want your part to be perfect. Oh, sorry. You don't want your part to be perfect. You want your part to be as easy to produce as possible. So you actually want the loosest tolerances that you can live with. So you need to know what are the boundaries. You got to do tolerance stack studies. You got to understand how badly can this part meet my requirements and still do the intended job. And that's going to give you more flexibility to go out and source it from different potential suppliers. You want to make your communication, your drawings, your specifications as clear as possible. You got to strive for clarity. And there's all sorts of pitfalls. I can remember one part, especially if you outsource outside of the US and you're dealing with people where English is not their first language, strange things can happen. I remember a part, the engineer had put, may not touch this surface, and then went to visit the production line, and the operators were all picking up the part from that surface. Why? Because if you learn English as a second language, what does may mean? It's conditional. So the engineer challenged the production folks and said, look, it says on the drawing, may not touch the surface. And the engineer in the plant said, yeah, but I may. So, be clear and think about the interpretation at the other end. If someone's reading your drawing, language issues is another layer, but in any case, really want to be clear. Any requirement that you make, it's got to be measurable. Not only this is what I want, but how are we going to confirm it? And if you're confirming it and they're confirming it, are you doing it the same way? So there's lots of places where miscommunication or lack of clarity can be problematic. And you're going to learn things along the way, of course. So you want to be communicating frequently with your team, with your supply chain. The other thing is formality. There's a big difference between a text message and a specification, and people will behave differently depending on how they receive the information. So revise your materials, make it formal, you're going to get more adherence to your requirements if they're more formal. And as my colleagues have said, interact with suppliers, go visit them. Risks can brew when you're not paying attention. So to the extent you can audit them and really be close with them, you're likely to have better results, or at least catch things going wrong sooner.
Yeah, when my clients come to me asking about, which manufacturer do I choose, what size do I choose, one thing I like telling them is that it's a lot like dating. The one that you start off with isn't necessarily the one you end up with. And so the one you go with for pilot production, for example, may not necessarily be the one you have to kind of hold yourself to in larger scale production. So some manufacturers are very skilled at small scale pilot level production, but are not very good at the larger scale part. So in line with what Andy was saying about making sure you're careful, making sure that they're doing quality checks and so on. Just kind of keep it at the back of your mind that you don't have to. You're not locking in to yourself to this manufacturer forever. Always be open to being able to jump manufacturers. And often, if you have good design documentation and good process documentation, you can actually make that process easier for yourself. So you can more easily change manufacturers as and when you need to.
Any other thoughts?
I mean, just I guess to summarize in terms of the accountability, what's written is remembered and what's repeated is applied. So when you write down your requirements and you have a pretty clear set of quality metrics that you are asking for, and you repeat them and you check them, and that's kind of how you can stay on top of your ecosystem of people that are helping serve your product.
So if we take a step back, hardware is hard, right? It's in that word is in the very name of hardware. However, that all being said, holding folks accountable, understanding the product that you want to create to surprise and delight your customer is extremely important. Now, when we vocalize hardware, there's sometimes, let's be honest, an allergic reaction when we approach VCs, even more so in the world of GPT and AI and so forth. And so as many of you, and as we think about the experience of the panel, when you're going for pre-seed, Series A, et cetera, how would you all define how best to communicate the execution on the hardware side as you think about product development? Who would like to go first?
I can kind of start us off and others can fill in. I think the goals with hardware development change at each of those stages. For example, at the pre-seed stage, your main goal is to make a strong case to your investors. So at that stage, you're not worried about DFM, DFT, all these things. You're just worried about proving your concept and making a demo that looks good to your investors. So in that situation, you care about just building a basic MVP, proof of concept, but at the same time, you may want to focus on things like springing for the super nice surface finish on your housing when you show them the demo, that kind of thing. So some aesthetic considerations, but also mostly just proving the concept. I think as you rise and as you start acquiring more funding, then you can think about other aspects like design for manufacture and so on. So it's kind of it's like kind of Russian doll. So you start from the core product vision, the MVP, and you keep adding on aspects of your design to kind of flesh out over time. So essentially, you can think of it as developing a sequence of prototypes. Rule of thumb is like 8 or so. And as you go through those prototypes, you start off with just validating the core concept. Then you add, okay, let me also now add to that layer design for manufacture. Let me also add to that layer design for pilot production. And so if you think about it as a layering process that you proceed on as you acquire more funding, that ends up driving a good sense of how to structure your prototypes as you go through.
Would anyone else like to comment?
Just to kind of talk about the general fundraising tier, I guess, expectations. In the pre-seed stage, I mean, it's a seedling. You're basically trying to prove to yourself that this idea is worth pursuing, and also, obviously, your investors, and you're usually, you're dealing mostly with angel investors to be able to prove the fundamentals and also to prove that there is a targetable market. When you go into seed stage, now you're going into like really the physical instantiation. So you really want to build maybe a subsystem or a prototype that feels like and functions like what you want, maybe not to the performance metric that you are targeting, but getting close to there and giving you the pathway that shows, okay, like I can do this, or if it's depends on what your risks are. If it's a supplier risk, that you can show that your supply chain is you can develop it, and or if it's a performance related thing, you are maybe 75% there, and with more funding and more prototyping, you can get there. At seed stage, you should have a functions like and acts like prototype that also gives you the performance metric. I keep saying performance because a lot of the companies that I worked for have been industrial scale. So, for example, I worked at Commonwealth Fusion Systems, and in order for them to prove a fusion reactor, you can't really build one to prove it. You have to make your problem more attackable. So you say, okay, I'm going to make a magnet, and I'm going to test the magnet. And if it gets me to the performance I want, then I can prove to myself that I can replicate this. So that's what they did, and that's where I'm kind of pulling from. And as you go into kind of Series A to Series B, that's when you really have your proof of concept. You have something, and you are now in the process of probably piloting or beta testing and getting it out into whether it's a deployment into the field, where if it's an industrial application, or if it's a consumer product, you probably are launching to a smaller group, not your entire market, but a smaller group, so that you can get feedback about your product. And then from Series B on, you're either dead or continuing to grow and scale.
Yeah, to double click what you said, I would argue, and I think we all would support, whether it's a onesie, right? It only goes up once and it's safety critical, versus a 10Z or a million, right? Like what we have everyone probably has in their pocket. Performance is really important to have that traceability, right? And repeatability and reliability. We've talked about a couple different terms, and I just want to make certain that the audience understands. So we talked about FMEA, we talked about DFX, we might have even said FOM or KPI. How many people don't know those terms? It's okay. Okay. Panelists, would you like to elaborate on those terms? Who would like to go first?
I can take DFX. So yeah, DFX is designed for something. So the most common ones you'll encounter are DFM, designed for manufacture, and DFA, designed for assembly. And these are disciplines that were actually developed locally by professors at UMass and University of Rhode Island, where in design for manufacture, the approach is looking in excruciating detail about the processes by which components will be manufactured. And that's knowing every last nuance about how a mold will be created, or machining will be done by what kind of tooling, and so on and so forth. And it was developed as a costing approach. If you can model very carefully how your components will be manufactured, you can, knowing labor rates in different regions and material costs, you can estimate what you ought to pay for a component. So it gives you a lot of power going into a supplier conversation if you're not relying on the quote first and then trying to negotiate the price down. If you know fundamentally what their costs should be, you can have a much more informed conversation. At the very least, you can challenge their assumptions. Maybe the assumptions that went into their cost are different than what you assumed, and now you're gonna learn about your product. Maybe there's a better way to make it, and so forth. Design for assembly is a process by which you're essentially scoring different design features of your assembly. The easier it is to go together, the better the score. The more, if it's sharp, if it's small, if it's heavy, if there's things that make it hard to manipulate, there's going to be penalty points assigned to it. And this allows you to compare different designs and get kind of a vector of, well, which one's likely to go together most easily. Again, it was developed as a cost optimization tool, but it also has a huge impact on quality. The simpler the part is to go together, the fewer opportunities for defects. You get a double whammy. You get better cost and you get better quality.
Anyone else?
I think kind of zooming out a bit, adding a kind of a higher level perspective, is that I've seen some clients get overwhelmed, and they build their first prototype or second prototype, and they think, oh, I got to design for everything, design for test, design for manufacture, design for reliability, all these things, sustainability. And I think to go back to the analogy I used before, the way I like to think about it is you want to start from your core vision, and then add these things by iterating over prototypes. There's actually a great article by a company called Delve called the 8 Essential Prototypes. And it basically frames prototyping as a product development process. So essentially, as you think about higher level DFXs, you can kind of add them to your design over time instead of trying to build them all into a single, the first or second prototype. The idea is that you're progressively de-risking aspects of your design over time. And sort of, there's some easy wins you can always make at each level. For example, if you think you might need some feature later on, you can kind of bring out a connector, bring out some communication lines or a power line or something on each revision. So there are some easy wins for sure you can kind of get on each prototype. But certainly you don't have to build everything into a single prototype. You can kind of stagger it and kind of incrementally start building these things over a span.
Thank you. We talked about performance, we talked about development life cycles. We really haven't honed in on regulatory or IP. I just want to highlight it's really important from a quality assurance side, from a bias side, whether you're integrating software, which inevitably that'll be part of it, to really think about the regulations, right? And to educate yourself or find the right subject matter expert to weigh in on what you're building and how it can impact others. An example, right, batteries exploding because that test case was not thought of or assessed when on an airplane, right, the life cycle there. Let's lean in a little bit on the IP side, more so than the regulatory side. What words of wisdom? I know we're not lawyers by training, but in terms of our experts and being in the companies and the capacities that we've had a background in, what are some words of wisdom as you engage with contractors, SME, subject matter experts, or contract manufacturers? When do you file IP? When do you make sure that's contained within the contract? Any words of wisdom that you all would like to share?
I would say when it comes to CMs or OEMs, it's really important to note if you're doing something off their catalog, essentially if it's not an off the shelf, if there's any type of development or like specific material or a specific application that you would be customizing their machines on or whatever you're buying, I think it's important to note if something is novel and treat it more as a co-development rather than we're just giving them our requirements and they're building it for us, because you run the risk of them owning the IP, and then if you have competitors that buy something from them, they could. There's no issue there, and there are co-development contracts that have very specific, this is a entire conversation, I'd say, with IP lawyer and CM consultant that could go on, because there's just many parameters that you need to think about of just can they sell it to someone else? Do they license it from you? Do you get royalties? There's many layers to it, but I think it's just important to be very mindful in specifically your IP strategy and how you intend to interact with your competitors.
A key kind of angle to what Sarah was saying is also keep in mind that IP is country specific.
Yeah.
So if you're making a piece of hardware, someone in China, for example, could easily clone the design, make it there, and distribute it, and you have no control over it because you only have the patent, for example, in the US.
That's right.
So those are situations to be mindful about. Sometimes you may feel it's worth to get a patent in multiple countries, but also there are other ways to kind of mitigate that. For example, if you're worried that someone in China might clone your hardware, maybe you should start focusing on your product more as a software product, which is a bit harder to copy. So think about those kinds of things, and yeah, just keep in mind that IP is country specific.
And the insourcing, outsourcing decision that you make should involve IP.
Let me back up a step on when we talk about IP or patents in this case. First thing is, in order to be patentable, an idea has to be novel, useful, and not obvious to someone skilled in the field. So unless you meet those criteria, don't bother seeking a patent. Now, there's a risk of filing a patent. Shreyas and Sarah talked about, someone copying your design. The key with a patent is you're making your design public. You're publishing your patent, and it's country specific. So you file a US patent, you've published the secret sauce. Anyone from any other country is gonna go on the internet and find your recipe and they can go do it. So if your features are the thing that's important to you, you may need to go get a patent in the countries where you intend to sell the product. If the secret part is the process by which you're making it, you may be better off just not revealing that, keeping it under non-disclosure with your supplier, because then you don't have to publish it to everyone. So there's lots of nuances. Definitely talk to a lawyer. But a patent doesn't give you the right to make your product. It just forbids others from making it. And if someone violates your patent, there is no US government agency that enforces patents. It's up to you to find out and then go sue them. So patents are not all they're cracked up to be. Sometimes they're the right path. Sometimes it's more risk than it's worth. They're also kind of expensive to maintain.
Yeah, if I may, I may riff off of that, which is, understand your strategic moat and how you're differentiated in your market, in your industry, and how you provide that value add, right? So there's something to be said about, as a function of time, patenting, copywriting, trademark, et cetera. Again, I'm not a lawyer. My encouragement here is, understand what you want to do ahead of time, and don't just say, hey, I'm about to approach a CM, I must patent. I'm about to go to a conference, everything I say at a conference is public, I must patent. There should be some strategic end to each step along the way. I know we were just signaled that we have maybe 15 minutes left. I'd like to open the floor up for questions. If there are no questions, then we'll go ahead and continue with questions on this side. Does anyone have a question? Anyone going for pre-seed or Series A? Some of the topics resonated and want to dive into. What do I need to present in front of a VC, or perspective on what to present in front of a VC? Anyone with a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
If you have an artistic product, what are some of the pros and cons for an artistic product? Are you understanding what I'm saying?
You mean with regard to patenting it, or some of the
Yeah.
other? Yeah. So you mean like patenting an appearance, a design, rather than a functional element?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think I'm qualified to answer that one.
I mean, I can take a crack at it, which is, when it comes to startup companies thinking about how their logo, right? Should they patent it? Should it be copyright? Should it be trademark, excuse me. Some people patent their, file a trademark or copyright on their logo, which to some extent defines the brand. So from a brand standpoint, were you thinking, was your question related to the brand associated with the product, or artistic? Tell me more about your question.
Say either jewelry or a item of clothing, or let's say maybe something ceramic.
So something where the appearance of the product is the magic part of it.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean, I can share, so at Da Vinci, our gateway is making garments smart. So to some extent, how the garment employs the sensors in the textile, that's something that we looked at patenting and have patented. It's more on the sensing side, but to your point, gentleman in the front, sorry, I don't know your name, Nate, there are different types of patents. Design patent is what he mentioned, if you didn't hear on, versus a utility, and I'm certain that there are others. I don't have that background to further comment, but happy to talk with you after.
Okay, so just so I can understand what you just said, what Da Vinci is doing.
Yes.
Is it like a sort of like a code that you're putting into the fabric, or
Good question. So it's more of a liner technology. So if we lined our bodies with intelligence, what would that look like? What would that layer look like? In this case, we've looked at yoga pants and underwear. Think of like a panty liner, an hourglass liner, as an example. What can it capture? And then along the waistband, what are some sensors? Because everyone wears clothing. Legally, we have to. So the thought process was, what aspects and attributes can we go ahead and look into? So that's just an example. I'm sure that there are many others. Yeah.
So when you say sensor, is it like a computerized type of thing?
Yeah, like a flexible printed circuit board, electronic in the waistband, and not in the hourglass to be more specific. The hourglass shape is a different sensing mechanism.
Wow.
Yeah. Thank you. You've let me elaborate on our tech. Yeah. Anyone else have a question?
I think there was one here, right here.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time today. In the process of product design, how do we go about assessing whether we need an external consultant for an issue we've identified? And then once we've done that, how do we go about identifying the right consultant or consulting firm for that issue?
Ooh, great question. Thank you. Both.
I think I can kind of take a stab. So, like what I was saying earlier, it's worth scaling the solution to the problem. And so, if you're a startup working on a novel hardware product idea, it's something worth thinking about. Is if you have a rough spec sheet in mind, and you want to get to a schematic, or if you have a schematic and you want to get a more refined schematic, and the things you're trying to solve have to do with making sure you're following best practices, making sure this device is cost efficient, energy efficient, all these things. You can solve a lot of them you can potentially solve a lot of them by going to, for example, a independent consultant, having them do a first pass, and then as you get deeper and deeper into product development, you may have more complex problems. Like, for example, what's the most efficient manufacturing process to use to make this device? So then those kinds of issues, as you get further down there, you may have to tap CMs, more like bigger companies. And so I guess the high level advice I would give is to make sure you're scaling the person you're going to the kind of problem that you have.
I would also add to that it should be a decision to go to a consultant versus insourcing or like hiring an engineer or an intern to do it. And the reason is obviously one, if there's an IP concern, you want to keep it as in-house as possible. Secondly, it's as you're kind of thinking through your product, think about the entire life cycle and what specifically you would need. If it's a specialty, if you need someone that has a specific specialty, then obviously a consultant might be good. For a short period of time, a consultant is perfect. But if it's something that requires consistent labor and is going to be for the next few years, that might be a good call to say, okay, maybe we're going to hire someone. And in terms of finding the right people, I mean, hiring is like a whole big thing right now. It's quite difficult. And also when it comes to consulting, but there's a company called Informal, if you've ever heard of them. They pre-screen a lot of engineers, and they have like a portfolio of people that they pull from. So they're a very good consulting contractor company that has like all skill sets within engineering and just technical background. That is just a resource for people if they don't know. The hardware meetups, if anyone has gone to them, they're run by Informal.
I've been to them. They're great. Can confirm.
Yeah, and I would say, you have to be a little bit humble and acknowledge what you don't know, and so really take a good hard look at your team and, are there skills we're missing, or is there expertise that is aligning with a risk area that we really need to pay attention to. And the other thing, it's about building relationships. You got to find people that you trust, that you feel confident are going to be able to do what they say they can do, are going to deliver on time, and collaborate effectively. So I think word of mouth is really the best way to go. Referrals, go back to a college professor that you trusted, and they have contacts in industry. mentorship arrangements and things like that. Yeah, it's hard to find people that you're going to click with that, are going to produce for you. So, yeah, have some structure around the selection process, how, the kinds of questions you're asking when you interview them, and really being clear about your expectations. But yeah, it's not a simple answer.
I would say kind of off that last point, in terms of finding people you can trust, something when choosing any CMs, OEMs, ODMs, something you can do is actually ask them to put you in touch with past customers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's been very helpful for me when trying to vet suppliers. So take advantage of that, early and often.
I do have a question. Thank you, first of all. But I do have a question about pricing your product. So let's say you have a product. I know part of it is how much does it cost to me. But then my question is about, as a designer, you need to also think about what is the value my product is bringing. Of course, you will have a team who's going to figure that out. But as a designer, what tools you can use to measure the value and you provide that input. So if you have any examples of that, that will be helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, great question. Who
I
wants
can
to go
jump in
first?
on
Yeah.
that one. So, actually, I would say the price has nothing to do with how much it costs to produce the product. The price is what the market will bear, is what people, what you really asked is a marketing question, not an engineering question. Okay.
Because usually when you go to the market, yes, it's a marketing question. But then I think as a designer, you need to provide input on the value of product and how you measure that as a designer, right? Okay, it's better A, B, C, D, but how much better? So you need to provide some data, I believe, to marketing folks as well, right? That's
Yeah,
what I was asking.
absolutely. There's a collaboration there. But as far as what you can charge for it, it's really what people are willing to pay for it. And of course, that has a lot to do with how you position it and how you identify those benefits that people will get from it. As in the back of house, things like DFM and DFA that we talked about earlier help you understand and predict how much is it likely to cost me, and then you look, okay, the market will bear X, and it's going to cost me Y, and is that enough margin to make this a worthwhile business? I don't think I entirely answered what you were going for, though. Maybe someone else wants to take a crack at it.
I can chime in if not. So, I'm an engineer by training, and I just say that to say this, which is I'm a visual learner. So if we anchor ourselves to, let's say we have a printed circuit board, right? And that's meant to track our steps, right? And we want to receive that on our phone. So, when we would go to a contract manufacturer, right, and say, I want the latest and greatest step counter, right? First, you go to the market and you say, hey, the willingness to pay is A, because there are all these other activity trackers there, which you can find on PitchBook as one of many that you can look at. And you could say, hey, there's a SaaS model, and then there's a hardware cost model, right, if they charge for the actual step counter. So that's you're grounded there. Then there's a thought process of, with economies of scale, if I'm just not making one, and I'm making 500, 10,000, 50,000, these are each, elbows in the curve that let you cost save, right? You can also use that to level set yourself to say, hey, I know this widget on an Arduino board is this amount of money, and I know I can cost optimize to the extent that it'll be less than $1 over time. I'm throwing out random numbers here, so don't quote me on this. So that then you feed that to your contract manufacturer, and you say, hey, I know contract manufacturer A, B, C, D, right, have told me that when I hit 10,000 or 50,000, I can get to less than $10, we'll say less than $10, $5, right? So now you know not only what the customer is willing to pay for that widget for another activity tracker, but you also know the profit margin that you can receive based on however you want to price your product. Does that helps to give you some metrics of, when I go from A to B, how can I cost optimize based on this hardware? This is very hardware specific. There are other examples, but just to give you a visual on an activity tracker, small PCB, it could be this big, or it could be, the size of your fingernail, depending on processes and so forth. Does that help a little bit? Yeah. So you would bring that to a contract manufacturer. strategize, right? But to Andy's point, right, it's very market-driven, demand-driven. Yeah. Anyone else? Questions? Yes. Oh, yeah.
Okay, one last question. We'll have
Okay,
to
one
wrap
last
it up.
question. Sorry.
Thank you. So to put you guys on the spot on IP, hypothetical situation, you have $100,000 in pre-seed funding. How much would you allocate for IP production versus product development?
That's an it depends question,
Yeah,
if I ever heard one. Depends how big, it depends on the risk profile, is there someone else who can block you from launching and you need to lock them out? Or, is it a secret that you can keep and spend the money somewhere else? It really is very situation dependent.
Sorry, I was going to say, it's also, it's one of the things where as you go through the product development timeline, you're making your product more and more visible. And so if IP is something you're concerned about, I would recommend doing it on the earlier side. Getting a patent is like, what, 15K at this point? So if you have 100K and you want to get a patent at some point, it's good practice to kind of just allocate that and then just file for that. And then that way, as you have more and more public conversations with manufacturers, other partners, you have that peace of mind, at least.
So I'm gonna just quickly promote an episode from my podcast where we talk about IP strategy. So the podcast is called The Builder Circle, and I talk to an IP attorney about just like IP strategy. So I highly recommend listening to that because if I remember correctly, I'm not an IP expert and I can't give like law advice in any way. But the most important thing to note is also like when you file a patent, it becomes public at some point and people can see it. So especially in a pre-seed, that might increase your risk too. So it's something to consider is like, is it worth it to do it super early? Because then, if you look at Apple's like Pro Max headphones, their patents were out before the product was, and they just kind of took the risk because they're not going to market that their patent is out. But so I think it's not a really linear logic or strategy. It's really, really dependent. But in pre-seed, I feel like product development needs more juice than anything because you need to prove to yourself that it's even worth pursuing. And if you dilute yourself, it might be difficult to do so.
And there's many different strategies. It depends what your desired outcome is. If you're trying to block a competitor, you might need a patent. If you're trying to make sure you don't get blocked, you don't necessarily have to patent it. You can just reveal it, right? And now it's public information and no one can patent it. So there's many strategies that can be applied depending on your objective.
Okay, great answers. Thank you.
And my colleague said it best. Thanks for giving us your time. Come find us after if you want to further engage, and have a wonderful rest of your day. A couple more notes.
All right, yeah, thank you. Also, the next panel, it's called IP Essentials for Protecting Your Innovations. So if you have further questions on IP, you should probably stay back. All right, so thank you everyone once again. We have a lot more in store for both today and the rest of the week. Especially we have a startup crawl happening this evening at 6 p.m. right here at Suffolk University. And now this room, specifically the next session is on protecting your innovation with IP Essentials. So if that is not what you're looking for, then you will need to change rooms, and our folks at the registration desk out front, they can help you to go where you need to be. And if you are sticking around for the next event in this room, please have your QR code ready to scan. We'll be coming to scan those for the next session. And for those of you joining us virtually, you don't have to go anywhere, you're all set. And lastly, for those of you in the early stages of your startup, this Friday, there is an opportunity to share your venture at the closing party. So check out the Startup Showcase open mic information at the welcome desk on the first floor lobby. And that's it. Have a good time, and I'll see you in a few minutes.